Hello and welcome to another live stream on Taliesin's map. And this is a live stream on the burning bush topic, which I've had a live stream on before, giving some of the basics, and I've touched on it elsewhere as well. But I wanted to give a more in-depth, step-by-step walkthrough of, first of all, the comparative mythology that shows that this parallel is strong, that it is there, that it can't be ignored, that it is important. And from there, once you understand the comparative mythology, this forces the exploration of the etymological questions, the linguistic questions around the word for the burning bush, of course, that we'll go into, um, as well as a couple other terms in the Bible. So we will show the importance of the comparative mythology first, and then try to point the direction towards the linguistic investigation that linguistic scholars should pursue based on what the comparative myth is telling us. So because of that, obviously, the linguistic element is something I'm pointing people towards rather than speaking authoritatively on. But to begin with, let's look at the details of the mythology, which I can lay out in a lot of detail, because let's see, we have the story of the burning bush. Um, at its foundation is, um, this encounter with some kind of form of the ineffable transcendent God. Um, a formless form in some sense, a powerful theophany, the theophany of theophanies, almost, almost like this ideal um, case of this just the image of what it would be like to encounter the transcendent face to face. It's like an all-consuming fire. Okay, but the thing is, there is reason to believe that this is not only just a generic trope, but that it was once again borrowed from a specific Indian mythos. Um, this hasn't been identified or realized before because of these key major changes that we will track in this comparison. And once you realize, that just these couple things were changed, making the myth suddenly unrecognizable outwardly, but leaving traces of that change having happened, and while all the rest of the form of the story is essentially kept the same. Okay, so that should sort of tell us, we can kind of see step by step what happened, and that's what's interesting. Okay, so I also want to mention that I'm probably going to have a short time today to walk through this. It's a long story with a couple of phases, looking at the myths and then the linguistics, and so most likely this will be a part one, and we will just stop abruptly at some point. I may not have that long today, and we'll come revisit this in part two. But to get the ball rolling, let's look at the step-by-step comparison. So, of course, the comparison that I've touched on before is the famous confrontation in the Puranas, in the Indian Puranas, the confrontation of the gods Brahma and Vishnu with the ineffable linga of fire, this column, this pillar of fire, within which is a phallus of fire, a linga, which is a sort of a sign, this symbolic symbol of the god, this aniconic icon, which is phallic. It has a phallic form or reference, but it is in itself a transcendent symbol somehow. And that transcendent symbol, the linga, appears inside of, in the midst of a burning pillar that is sort of endless, an endless pillar of fire, which appears in front of the other two main gods, Brahma and Vishnu, who are fighting at the time about who's the greatest. Confronts them. It announces to them that it is it is the true transcendent god Shiva, and it identifies itself with a three-letter name, which symbolizes the transcendent deity, and that is Aum, Aum. But also it states that it's actually a four-part name because Aum includes what is called a half matra after the three letters, and the half matra is like sort of resonant silence or something that follows the three letters. So it's really a four-part name. It says the three letters and the half a matra thereafter. Okay, and that three or four letter name symbolizes the transcendent god Shiva, who is, and he describes how that name encompasses all existence and everything that transcends existence. You know, the transcendent deity, all in all being and non-being. And then Shiva says, "They call me Om." You know, he says he takes the first person to say basically, "I am Om. They call me Om." This word that he is, the word that is the Brahman, the transcendent deity. Shiva announces to them that he is that. And there's the most famous version is this pillar of fire with the linga of fire that is Shiva within it, appearing before these two gods. And there's another version where it's just one god, Brahma, and the linga of fire appears only to Brahma alone. You know, that's interesting that there's that variation, because in the story of Moses, there's only one Moses who is confronted by the burning bush, the burning seneh. But in the Puranas, there's variation, either one or two. And I should say, it doesn't really matter. A version involving one Moses could easily have been adapted from a story where two gods are being confronted. That wouldn't be a big jump, but it's interesting and important to note that there is a version where it's just one deity, and it's Brahma, and he's confronted alone by Shiva, and Shiva, rather than it being a contest where the other gods are saying they are the greatest, and then they're kind of put in their place. Instead of that, it's more a direct transmission from Shiva to Brahma to carry on Shiva's work in the creation. He kind of gives him his ordinance and his powers to do creation as Brahma in that version of the story. And the same powers are given to Vishnu and Brahma in their version of the story. It's sort of, they're put in their place, but they are then given the powers of the mantras of Shiva to do the creation and to uphold Shiva's plan and creation and that sort of thing. Okay, so let's walk through each step here. The burning seneh, that is the Hebrew word for the burning quote-unquote bush, and I'll show why this word probably did not mean bush originally, and that it is sort of a translation error or an intentional mistranslation, changing of the meaning of the word that happened over time, if we get to that. But that is also part of this, because if this mythological parallel is compelling and shows us that the source material was a linga, this mysterious symbolic word that has a phallic image associated with it, if that was the original thing that appears within, or rather, I should say, it's complicated because seneh does not map to linga. Seneh is the bush, and inside the bush, a supposed heart of fire appears. So it is one thing appearing inside of another, and they're burning in the Bible. In the Shiva story, one thing is appearing inside of the other. It is the linga appearing inside of the pillar. So seneh actually, as we will see, maps to a word for a pillar originally. And that is what we will explore and explain later on. But in any case, let's get to the mythological parallel to lay the groundwork. The burning seneh, this mysterious word that I am arguing is an adapted word, a changed word, a mistranslation of Exodus 3, has an uncanny parallel in an Indian myth. The story of the theophany of Shiva as the linga of fire within the um, endless pillar, of course, found in multiple Puranas. And I should say this is across multiple Puranas, which have branched out from some kind of Ur Puranic tradition back lost in the sands of history and prehistory, or, before kind of written records in India are clear or existent. There is among scholars a belief that there was some kind of proto-Puranic tradition even in the BC era, even though the Puranic texts that we have appear in AD, of course. But because there's so many branches, there's multiple versions of the story across separate, distant Puranic traditions from one another in different forms. It strengthens the case that this is just a native Indian tradition with deep roots coming from something farther back where they branched off into these into this variety. And that is part of my argument, is that there is a proto-Puranic version of this tradition that was accessed by the biblical author and adapted directly from it. So it's not that they were adapting from the written Puranas that we have from AD, of course. It's that this existed in a BC era proto-Purana tradition that scholars believe probably existed, and this is a snapshot coming from that. Okay, so but this story is in multiple Puranas, so you can kind of track and compare the different details in each, which is helpful and interesting. So the summary is a burning theophany of an unchanging fire that speaks its mystical 3 or 4, as I said, part name, representing the god who encompasses transcendental reality. This is in primarily Shiva Purana 1.7 and Shiva Purana 7.2.34 through 35. And so that is, as you can see, it's in 2 separate sections or chapters of the Shiva Purana, with some of the key details. So it's spread out into these 2 different events, but they're both, part of the same story. You can tell the same details are happening, but it's being elaborated on in chapter 7. The roots of the fire pillar in Indian tradition, that represents transcendental reality, are found in the Skamba pillar of Atharva Veda 10.7, as well as in Rig Veda 4.14.4 through 5 and 4.13.5, and also 9.86.46. And so those are hymn verses and hymn sections where the skamba of heaven is representing the absolute transcendent Brahman of some kind in both the Atharva Veda and the Rig Veda, sort of the power, the self-determining power underlying everything, or as in the Atharva Veda version, very clearly encompassing and transcending being and non-being, and encompassing all that is and will be and everything that is and is not, somehow, right, as we have read. So you can look at the Skamba hymn to get a predecessor of this pillar form that is infinite, and that also has fire kind of within it. Like in the Skamba hymn, he says that Vaishnavara, which is Agni, is kind of within him. That is, so there's references to the fire that is within him or is supported by him, by the pillar, and that sort of thing. So he's also called the reed of gold in the waters. So it's like a reed, gold, like golden reed pillar among the waters. Some mystical imagery that might remind us of some of the pillar, the infinite pillar or linga, the burning linga, the reed of gold. It's all kind of in a tradition. And then also in the Satarudriya of Yajurveda and Shvetashvatara Upanishad, there are details or names that can be, I would say, that show signs of this continued tradition coming from the Vedas of Shiva as the all in all transcendent God. So there was a sort of a continued tradition, the proto-Shaivite tradition, or what have you, of the Vedic era came out of the Vedas, clearly, Atharva Veda, and the Rig Veda mentions of Skamba, the pillar of heaven, and that took this sort of Shaivite angle more emphatically in these other moments that came out most fully in the Shiva Purana, or that whole Puranic tradition that has this story. So the parallel between Exodus 3 and Puranic Shiva Linga theophany can be mapped as follows. The witness, that is Moses or Brahma/Vishnu, sees the god, whoever the god is, within a mysterious burning object, and the fire does not consume or does not increase or decrease. So in both cases, the fire is emphasized as being unchanging in a sort of unnatural, supernatural kind of way. So in the biblical version, it says that the fire doesn't consume. In the Puranic version, it very clearly says the fire does not increase or decrease. So it's emphasizing a similar note. As we see here, quote, "The bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed," Exodus 3:2. And the linga had thousands of flames. It did not increase or decrease. And that is from the Shiva Purana. Number 2, God's stand-in appears in the midst of the fire. So, quote, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a seneh. God called to him out of the bush," or rather seneh. That is Exodus 3:2 and also 4. And again, I have to keep emphasizing bush when it appears in these English translations. That's just a translation. That is the conventional translation of seneh, which I am arguing was not actually what the word meant in its earliest meaning. And in the Vayu Purana version of the story, it says, quote, "I, Brahma, hastened towards that flame." So Brahma is in the role of Moses, the equivalent position of Moses. So the massive column of flame stood touching heaven and earth. In the midst of it, we saw the unmanifest linga of excessive brilliance. Okay, so as we can see, the angel of the Lord is in the flame of fire out of the seneh. So the flame of fire is in the midst of, or out of the bush seneh. So flame of fire out of seneh. Here we have the linga of excessive brilliance in the midst of the column. So column equals seneh, linga equals the flame of fire, also translated as heart of fire, as we will see. So one thing which is like the vessel or symbolic representation of the deity itself, in the midst of or inside of a bush or pillar, a seneh or pillar. One thing inside of another. That's a key image to keep in mind. Number 3, the witness of the theophany stops what they are doing and says that they must look closer to investigate what nature of thing it is. Quote, "Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the seneh is not burned up." Unquote, from Exodus 3:3. And, quote, "Ceasing from their fight, Brahma and Vishnu, they began to think, what is this?" Unquote, from Shiva Purana 7.2.34, 0.32 through 36. And, quote, "What is this wonderful form? What is this column of fire that has risen up? It is beyond the range of senses. We have to find out its top and bottom." Unquote, from Shiva Purana 1.7.13 through 14. Then number 4, the witness commanded to take off sandals on sacred ground of the seneh, in the Moses case, versus purificatory steps for linga worship that are given. Also, Brahma does penance to see the theophany in the Vayu Purana version. So there are not identical elements associated with the linga about purification before it or penance before seeing it, compared to the taking off sandals for Moses. So not identical, but a similar theme. Quote, then he, Yahweh said, or rather, the angel of God that's speaking for Yahweh, then he said, "Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground, unquote, from Exodus 3.5. And, quote, the devotee shall make the linga of the proper size in the manner prescribed in the Shaivite scriptures. Selecting an auspicious spot, he shall test the ground. He shall perform the 10 forms of service. But before the actual performance of this service, Vinayaka shall be worshipped. After purifying the spot and other rites, he shall take the linga to the ablution chamber. So, ablutions, water purifications, unquote. Shiva Purana 7.2.36. Quote, a great penance was performed with very intensive concentration by Brahma, the creator of the universe. When 1,000 yugas passed, a supreme radiance, the linga, sprang up in front of him, piercing the 7 netherworlds and illuminating the faces of all quarters. Unquote. From the Skanda Purana version 4.2.73.77 through 78. And also, quote, with shoes on his feet, he shall not eat, sit down, salute, or worship the gods, unquote. So this is a generic ordinance for worship in the Dharma Sutras. So just within the Indian tradition, more broadly, there is at least one example of, having to remove shoes in order to worship the gods. This is more generic, showing that there are you can see how this is a continuous theme, slightly different in the Indian version, but there are pieces there that can be compared. And that is in Gautama Dharma Sutra 9.45 and Apastamba Dharma Sutra 1.4.14.22. I think you can get the idea there. The ordinances for purifying before worshiping the linga, they appear right after the linga appearance story in the Shiva Purana. They appear after that, and then in the Skanda Purana version involving Brahma alone, you can see that he does penance in order to make the linga appear to him and then speak to it or receive illumination from it. Okay, and then in the Dharma Sutras, it's a general thing that removing shoes is important before worshiping the gods. So they all kind of tie it together. You can get the idea. Number 5, fiery theophany. This fiery theophany in both cases speaks a 3-part name signifying the transcendent absolute, or 3 to 4-part, as we have discussed. God, Yahweh, says to Moses, I am who I am, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Exodus 3.14. So, okay, this is 2 quotations here. God said to Moses, I am who I am, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And then he also says, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you, as we know. So you can see Yahweh restates his name in a couple different ways, but it's referencing back to this Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is a 3-part breakdown of his name, but then also the Tetragrammaton, which is a 4-part breakdown into the letters of his name. And so he kind of says both of those back to back, and they clearly have a transcendental symbolic reference, pointing to the fact that these letters of the Tetragrammaton refer back to I am who I am, or I am who I will be, and that sort of thing. The letters of the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, have in themselves, they refer to his encompassing all of existence. Okay, that's kind of the key. In the Shiva version, it is quite similar. So, quote, then there manifested the single-syllabled Brahman in the characteristic way of a word with its sound Aum, which is traditionally AUM. It expressed the Brahman. So there manifests out of this pillar linga of fire this AUM syllable. Then that syllable divided itself into four. The three matras, A, U, Ma, and half the matra thereafter, unquote, from Shiva Purana 7.2.35.1 through 3. And like I said, the half a matra thereafter, it's some sort of silence or resonant silence that follows the three letters, and that indicates sort of the ineffable, that is sort of the ineffable portion of the name, in some sense, if I understand correctly. And then it says, quote, then a loud sound, Aum, issued out of the column. So it's more explicit in another line in the Linga Purana that it's issuing out of the column. This AUM issues out of the column, unquote, from Linga Purana 1.17.49. Number 6, God has a second self-naming statement, and in this statement he uses more, points to himself, uses my or me in some fashion. Quote, God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, and this is the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations, unquote, from Exodus 3.15. And in the Shiva Purana, quote, Shiva says, thus they call me Aum, and that is AUM, unquote. Shiva Purana 7.2.52 to 53. And like I said, or I should clarify, that Shiva says that after he's explained the AUM. So it's similar to how Yahweh says this reiteration of his name, of the Tetragrammaton, after he has announced himself and explained himself as Ehya Asher Ehya. He then calls himself the Tetragrammaton. So also after Shiva has explained AUM, he says, and its transcendental meanings, he says, thus they call me Aum, just pointing it back to himself, confirming that he, Shiva, is that Aum, and that is his name. Number 7, the witness, Moses or Brahma Vishnu, shields their face or head and shows fear. So, quote, and Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God, unquote, from Exodus 3.6. And quote, Brahma and Vishnu joined their palms in reverence above their heads and spoke thus in fright to the Lord, unquote, from Shiva Purana 7.2.61. So you can see it is quite the same type of image of clearly fear, afraid versus fright, and hiding their face versus just holding their palms over their head, kind of shielding themselves. Yes. Number 8, the witness expresses self-doubt. Very interesting beat that it hits, sort of a minor, subtle beat, but it's consistent in both cases. Quote, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt, unquote, from Exodus 3:11. And from the Shiva Purana, quote, let my ignorance alone, O Lord. So this is, because it's the Shiva Purana version, that means it's Brahma and Vishnu speaking, because they are together in the Shiva Purana. So they say, let my ignorance alone, O Lord. When you are near, who can fearlessly talk about his duty or that of others? O Lord, I do not have the power of eulogizing you in the manner befitting your greatness. So see that, yes, Yahweh's asking Moses to go be his mouthpiece and speak for God and lead the Israelites, essentially. And here they're saying, we don't have the power of eulogizing you. We don't have this power that you're kind of demanding of us in this moment. On the other hand, if the devotees keep quiet in front of the Lord, it is merely a transgression of virtue. So that is another self-criticism. We can't keep quiet. That would also be not virtuous. So what is proper to be achieved is the relevant point now. Without knowing anything, I have blurted out something for which I pray to be excused. That you were the primordial cause we forgot due to your Maya. I am deluded, puffed up, and have hence been chastised by you. Of what avail is this submission, O Lord? I am extremely afraid, because I have endeavored to determine your size when in fact you cannot be gauged. So you can see that competition of trying to gauge the size of the pillar is unique to the Indian tradition, because it has to do with this competition between Brahma and Vishnu, and that is not part of the Moses story. Number 9, the god gives power to the witness. Quote, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it, unquote, from Exodus 3:20. And also Exodus 4, he gives staff powers and leprosy powers to Moses. So it's just further additional powers that he also gives, including saying that he will strike out and do wonders. In the Indian tradition, quote, eschew a recurrence of your dispute and forget the shame. Devoid of mutual rivalry, you, Brahma and Vishnu, shall resume your respective duties. Formerly at my command, the compendiums of knowledge were given to you in order to proclaim your causal nature. The jewel of mantras, consisting of 5 syllables, has been imparted to you. But you forgot all this. I shall give you everything as before, together with my behest, since without that you cannot create or sustain. After telling Vishnu and Brahma thus, the Lord gave them the principal mantra along with Jnana Samhita, unquote, from Shiva Purana 7.2.75 through 80. Okay, so we can see that what Shiva does is he reminds them and gives them his behest as well as the mantras of power, which they need, which Vishnu and Brahma need and will use in order to carry out Shiva's plan of creation and sustaining of the world, of the cosmos. So that's more what it's about for this story. But nonetheless, he's empowering them with specific sort of magical powers from him, similar to Moses, and also giving him his blessing, his behest. And then it says in the Skanda Purana version, quote, with my favor, may you, Brahma, have the capacity to create things, unquote. Skanda Purana 4.2.73.150. And number 10 gives behest to do the work of the god. So it's a continuation of the last one, obviously. Brahma/Vishnu get power to create versus Moses to rescue the Hebrews. So, quote, now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Okay, so you can see that is clearly a continuation. That is Exodus 3:10, and quote, devoid of mutual rivalry, you shall resume your respective duties. And that was also quoted already. So a bit of a repetition there, but I wanted to divide those 2 points, that he gives them powers and then he also gives them a behest to do the work, and those are intertwined. Number 11, he gives specific injunction of religious worship for future on the present sacred mountain that they're on, and gives his presence and also a sign to the witness in both stories. He does, the god, Yahweh versus Shiva, does this same set of things. Quote, Yahweh said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain, unquote, from Exodus 3:12. And this is a very debated and mysterious line, what the reference is, because it's vague. He says, this shall be the sign for you. What? And everyone, scholars ask, what is the sign? The burning bush that has just appeared is the sign, or what he's saying right now is the sign, or the fact that in the future you will worship here will be the sign that I sent you, or it's like because it's stated like confusingly, scholars are kind of baffled. There's different theories about what this should be referring to. What exactly is the sign? This shall be the sign. I think if you look at the Indian source material, you can see that it's an adaptation of what they have there. And the Hebrew author tried to boil that down and made it confusing by boiling it down. And it's pretty much that. So if we look at the Indian material, quote, and this is mostly from the Shiva Purana version, quote, ever since that, Indra and other gods, asuras, sages, men, serpents, as well as women, install lingas, and the word linga means a sign or emblem, as well as phallus. That's its dictionary definition. Linga can just mean sign or emblem, but also has this reference to a phallic image as well. But they install lingas, which means signs or emblems, in accordance with the injunctions and worship him in the linga. And that's from Shiva Purana 7.2.85. And also, quote, in order to clarify my ishatva, unknown hitherto, I have manifested myself immediately in the embodied form of Isha. The ishatva in me is to be known as the embodied form, and this symbolic column is indicative of my Brahmatva. So his Brahmatva is like his Brahma power, I guess, or Brahma form or Brahma power, I'm not sure. But he's saying that the Ishatva in me, so the Lord power, I guess, Ishatva, Isha is like Lord, and when they say Atva, it refers to like the power of that thing, I think, in some sense. But correct me if I'm wrong. So the Ishatva in me is to be known as the embodied form, and this symbolic column is indicative of my Brahmatva. Okay, you can see the embodied form somehow symbolizes his lordhood, and the column itself indicates his Brahmahood, or Brahma power. You can see how that is like similar to the symbol of Yahweh that's vaguely being given to Moses. And then it goes on, since it has all the characteristics of my phallic emblem, it shall be my symbol. Okay, so the embodied form of Isha is the original thing he's talking about. Somehow, to clarify his lordhood, his Ishatva, or Lord power, Shiva has manifested himself immediately in an embodied form of Isha. That embodied form, it is it's to be known. So it's to be known as his embodied form, and the column indicates his Brahmahood. So somehow his own presence as an embodied form and as a pillar indicates these powers, these presences of the god. Since it has all the characteristics of his phallic emblem, so because that pillar, I think, has the characteristics of the phallic emblem, it shall be my symbol. Okay, you can see it's very convoluted and confusing, but he's giving his symbol by his presence in these forms, including the pillar form and phallic emblem form, which overlap. O sons, you shall worship it every day. The phallic symbol, the linga, and the symbolized Shiva are non-different. So he's conflated them. He's saying they are identified with one another. Hence, this phallic emblem is identical with me. It brings devotees quite near to me. It is worthy of worship, therefore. O dear sons, if phallic emblem of this sort is installed, I can be considered installed. So the phallic emblem is him, is Shiva, though my idol is not installed. So he's saying, even if there's not an idol of his Shiva form, if the phallic emblem, the linga, is there, it can be considered identical with Shiva, and the embodied idol is not necessary. So it's a way of explaining the priority of icons and aniconic icons, and the importance, the priority of the linga itself, where it should be used in the worship of Shiva. So that's an important sort of theological explanation within Shaivism around the linga. But that whole convoluted comparison of the Shiva form versus the linga form versus the pillar, that is not important to Yahweh. So they flatten that down in the Hebrew version to something more sort of tried to boil that down and simplify it. And I think the wording of how they boiled it down became unclear what they were referring to. So you can kind of see that. And then it continues, quote, O dear sons, the truthful extract of everything has been narrated to you with demonstration. You shall recite as directed by the goddess this Om mantra, which is identical with me. Your knowledge shall be stabilized. Permanent fortune shall stand by you on the Chaturdashi day and on the day with Ardra star, the recital of this mantra will give you everlasting efficacy. Unquote from Shiva Purana 1.10.32 to 33. Such is the installation of Shiva's great phallic emblem, which shall be worshipped with due homage. The daily worship shall be made in accordance with one's capacity, so also the fixation of banner, etc. Unquote from Shiva Purana 1.11.24. And continues, quote, Shiva says, I shall give you everything as before, together with my behest, since without that you cannot create or sustain. So again, this whole long thing, to me, it's paralleling when Yahweh says, this will be, let's just revisit what Yahweh says. I will be with you. So it's his presence will be with Moses, and he's promising that. And this shall be the sign for you. Somehow this presence or this statement, or the linga, or rather, the burning bush, the seneh, the pillar that has manifested there, the heart of fire, whatever you want to say, this event or the presence of God that comes from it shall be the sign for you that it is I, Yahweh, who sent you when you have brought the people out of Egypt. So it's all connecting to the mission that he's giving Moses and saying, this empowers you, this gives you my presence and my sign to serve me and carry out my project, my wishes. So similarly, we have Shiva saying, I shall give you everything as before, together with my behest, since without that you cannot create or sustain. He's sending Brahma and Vishnu to do his project, which is to create or sustain. You can see in the Bible version, the mission is to go bring the Israelites out of Egypt. In the Puranic version, the mission being given is to create and sustain. They just slotted in these two different missions into the same slot in the two different stories. And it continues, after telling Vishnu and Brahma, thus the Lord gave them the principal mantra along with Jnana Samhita, as we've touched on before. After obtaining the divine order of the Lord, the jewel of mantra, pregnant with meaning, and the kalas, they prostrated at the feet of the Lord. They stood without fear. They were overpowered by joy. Unquote. From Shiva Purana 7.2.35.77 through 80. And, quote, O sons, this column without root or top will henceforth be diminutive in size for the sake of the vision and worship of the world. Once again, he's giving them a version of his symbol that they can carry with them. Okay, so that's similar to Yahweh saying, this will be the symbol that I am with you. Here, Shiva is giving them, saying you can have this diminutive, small version of the column. It will be diminutive in size, a diminutive version of the column or the linga that you can install as my presence. The phallic emblem, that is the linga, confers enjoyment. It is the only means of worldly enjoyment and salvation. Viewed, touched, or meditated upon, it wards off all future births of the living beings. Since the phallic emblem rose high, resembling a mountain of fire, this shall be famous as Ruddy Arunya Mountain. Many holy centers will spring up here. So now Shiva is talking about the mountain they're on at this very moment, where the fiery pillar arose, and he's saying, the linga itself was like a mountain of fire burning there, and now on that ruddy mountain, holy centers of worship will spring up there now in the future. A residence or death in this holy place ensures liberation. The celebration of chariot festivals, the congregation of devotees, the presentation of ordinary as well as sacrificial gifts, and offering of prayers at this place shall be millionfold efficacious. Of all my sectors, this sector shall be the greatest. A mere remembrance of me at this place shall accord salvation to all souls. Hence this sector shall be greater than all other sectors, very auspicious, full of all sorts of welfare, and according salvation to everyone. Worshipping me in my supreme phallic form at this place and performing the other sacred rites shall accord the 5 types of salvation. May all of you achieve all your cherished desires. Unquote. Shiva Purana 1.9.19 through 27. And quote from the Skanda Purana version, O Lord of Devas, if you are delighted, if a boon is to be given to me, then, O Shankara, May your presence be in this great linga. I do not choose any other boon, unquote. So that's Brahma speaking to Shiva saying, oh, the only boon I want is that your presence be in this great linga that I can then worship. Okay, so that ties back to Yahweh giving his presence, giving his symbol to Moses to be with him, and also what Yahweh says, which is that Moses, you will establish worship on this mountain in the future. Just like Shiva says exactly the same thing, worship will be established on this very mountain where this has happened in the future. So let's revisit the Exodus version. Yahweh says, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. Some vague thing will be the sign, but we can see how that maps from all that discussion in the Shiva Purana version. His presence somehow in whatever sign is being given. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So it concludes, Yahweh's big thing concludes, in the future, you, Moses, shall serve God, worship, on this very mountain where this has happened. Again, the identical thing. Because the phallic member arose on this Arunya mountain, many holy centers will spring up here, and celebration of chariot festivals, congregation of devotees, and the presentation of ordinary sacrificial gifts at this place shall be millionfold efficacious. This will even be the greatest of all his sectors of worship. Okay, so yeah, it's the same conclusion, the same beats in the same sort of connection and order. Incredibly uncanny. Okay, so let's go to the summary of this in a chart here. Just to quickly recap. First, the unchanging fire in the mysterious object. In Exodus 3, the seneh was blazing, yet it was not consumed. And in the Puranas, Shiva Purana, the wonderful linga of the Lord appeared in between them, in between Brahma and Vishnu. It had thousands of flames. It did not increase or decrease. So not consuming fire versus not increasing or decreasing fire. This is some sort of unnatural, supernatural fire. Fire should increase or decrease. Fire should consume, but it is not. That indicates its transcendence, its eternality somehow, that it is not consuming or increasing or decreasing. God standing in the midst of the fire. So this is, again, this very important, very carefully phrased image that they have in both stories, where the stand-in, the voice of God, the symbol of the high God, actually appears in a form that is inside of another form. And yeah, it's two things coming together, one symbol inside of another, and that is an important part of this. In Exodus, quote, the angel of the Lord, and that is sort of just the voice, the stand-in for Yahweh, appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of a seneh. So the flame of fire or heart of fire, however it's translated, appears out of the midst of another thing, which is the seneh, usually translated as bush. God called to him, so then it's instead of the angel, it says God called to him, Moses, out of the seneh. And then in the Vayu Purana version, quote, I, Brahma, hastened toward that flame. The massive column of flame stood touching heaven and earth. In the midst of it, in the midst of the column, we saw the unmanifest linga. Vayu Purana 55.19. So one thing which is the symbolic representation of the transcendent deity inside of another thing that is burning. Okay. And then there's a pause to investigate what the nature is. I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the seneh is not burned up. Exodus 3:3. In Shiva Purana, quote, ceasing from their fight, they began to think, what is this? And, quote, what is this column of fire? We have to find out its top and bottom, unquote. So it's a pause to investigate this moment of curiosity and wonder and surprise. Sacred ground purifications, removing sandals in the Exodus 1, and selecting an auspicious spot. He shall test the ground in Shiva Purana, purifying the spot and other rites. He shall take the linga. So purifying and testing the ground in Shiva Purana, and a great penance is performed by Brahma before encountering the linga in the Skanda Purana. And then a 3+1 part sonic absolute name on the pillar. And again, to me, 3 versus 4 is not a crucial distinction, because you could find a story of a 3-part name and adapt it to one with a 4-part name, because you wanted your God's name, to have 4 parts. And that wouldn't be a significant change to me. But it is important to note that the Aum name can be both. You can refer to it as AUM, that's 3 letters, obviously, but in its technical definition, it is 4-part, as it's spelled out, with the half a matra being included in its correct technical explanation. So that is interesting to me, because it makes it difficult to map one-to-one with the biblical one, because it's hard to tell if the AUM plus half a matra, does that map to Ehye Asher Ehe, which is a 3-part breakdown of Yahweh's name, or does it map to the tetragrammaton YHWH, which is 4 letters? It could be either one, but you can see that it's interesting that there's a variation even in the biblical one, where it's a 3-part explanation, Ehye Asher Ehye, 3-part, and then there's also right after that the 4 letters YHWH, and those are supposed to refer to the same thing. It's the same, I don't know, it's similar. So in Exodus 3:14, Ehye Asher Ehye has sent me, and that means I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. I am, however different scholars have translated that. And in Linga Purana, quote, Aum manifested, divided into A-U, Ma plus half a matra, attached to the southern, northern, middle of the blazing linga, 3-part, division of even the linga. And then, of course, it goes into more painstaking, detailed breakdown of the 3 letters and what they map to in the cosmos, how they encompass the cosmos as well. So in a much more extended way in the Purana there. And in the Linga Purana, it says, quote, then a loud-sounding Aum issued out of the column, unquote. So then there's, like I said, also a second emission, a second statement of the divine name, but referring more emphatically back to the God, saying, that is my name, this is me, using me/my of some kind. In Exodus, quote, YHWH says, YHWH, or the Lord, this is my name forever, in Exodus 3:15. And then in Shiva Purana, quote, thus they call me Aum, unquote. And then fearful reverence before the blaze, quote, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And, quote, Brahma and Vishnu joined the palms in reverence above their heads and spoke thus in fright to the Lord, unquote. Very similar. Self-doubt before the infinite about the duties that are being impressed upon them in this moment. Quote, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt, unquote. From Exodus. And from Shiva Purana, quote, O Lord, when you are near, who can fearlessly talk about his duty or that of others? I do not have the power of eulogizing you, deluded by Maya, unquote. So they doubt themselves. They're in this state of doubt that has to be reassured then by the God right after that to empower them to do the work. So then, of course, the sacred power or knowledge is granted after that doubt. In Exodus, quote, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will perform in it, unquote, as well as the staff powers that are given in the next chapter. And unquote, and in Shiva Purana, quote, I shall give you the principal mantra along with Jnana Samhita, and with my favor, may you, Brahma, have capacity to create in the Skanda Purana version. And along with that, the commission to do the divine task, quote, from Exodus, go bring my people out of Egypt, unquote. And in Shiva Purana, quote, devoid of mutual rivalry, you shall resume your respective duties. Taking the Israelites out of Egypt is in the spot, in the position of the creation duties that Shiva is sending Brahma to do, or Brahma and Shiva. And then, of course, the mountain worship of the divine and the sign/presence that he gives them to have as the sign of the God with them. Quote, I will be with you so Yahweh's presence will be with Moses, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. So somehow that word, that Hebrew word for sign, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It's vague. A lot of times a vague thing is vague because it is symbolically laden in a way that they're trying to just make this word sign somehow carry the mystical presence of the God. But that's what the word linga does in the Puranic version. The word linga means sign, but it's this richer word that is explained more fully. So there's just more explanation in the Puranic version. In the Hebrew version, the explanation's been cut away. So all we have is, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain, unquote. And in the Shiva Purana, quote, ever since that linga appearance, Indra and other gods install lingas in accordance with the injunctions and worship him in the linga, which means sign or emblem. This shall be famous as Ruddy Mountain, worshipping me in my supreme phallic form at this place. Shiva Purana 1.9.21 through 26. And quote, since it has all the characteristic features of my phallic emblem, it shall be my symbol. O sons, you shall worship it every day. This phallic emblem is identical with me. It brings devotees quite near to me. If phallic emblem of this sort is installed, I can be considered installed, unquote. Shiva Purana 1.9.42 to 44. Okay, so you can see, I think, that there was a bunch of convoluted description and explanation about the symbolic presence of Shiva in the linga, which means sign, and that's being given, and that was boiled down to, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. A mystical sign is given, but of course they didn't want to make it a linga, they didn't want to make it a phallus and all of that, but it's also referring back to the wording that they have when the burning seneh appears at all, and that is, I think once you explain how the etymology of the words used in Hebrew actually tie back to words that were originally equivalent to linga, phallus, symbolic phallus, and pillar, you can see that subtext was still there in the Hebrew original, but was lost over time through the misunderstanding of the original words, and even potential intentional recontextualizing, intentional changing, conflating of the meanings of those words so that they went in a different direction with the understanding of what the seneh was. Okay, so because of how intensely paralleled this story is in the Puranic tradition and the biblical Exodus story, it forces someone to do the work of digging into the etymology of the word seneh, and also the etymology of the word labat esh, which is the word for the flame of fire or heart of fire that appears in the seneh. So these two words are linked together, making a complex image of one symbol inside of another. And because that's there in the Shiva Purana version with linga inside of pillar, we have to take seriously the possibility that if this was the source mythologically for the burning bush story, then at some point the image had to change from linga to bush. Okay, if the image changed from linga to bush, either they just changed the words entirely and they're like, we don't want to have a linga, we don't want to have a phallus, we're just going to make it a bush. Either that happened, or there was a mistranslation actually of the words. So that gives us sort of the warrant to investigate. So think of it like a police investigation. Before understanding this mythological parallel, there was no probable cause, there was no evidence to get a warrant from a judge to investigate this etymology, because the tradition says seneh means bush. Therefore, we should accept what the tradition says. There's no clear alternative. There's no reason to doubt the tradition, even though the etymology is actually unstable and unclear. If everyone in the tradition, Hebrew tradition, is saying seneh just means bush, well, they're the experts, they are the tradition. We should just take that at face value and say, perhaps that's explained in some way that has been lost, even though linguistically it doesn't paint a clear picture, to say the least. But with the mythological parallel, it urges the question that we have to look at the possibility of it being, of the word not actually meaning bush originally. And so experts need to weigh in and look into that more seriously because of the parallel. But in order to do that, I need to lay out the details. I need to point the direction. Okay, I'm put in the position to do that, even though I'm not a linguist. So join with me on this next part of the exploration as we take a serious look at the proposed ways that seneh has been explained or half explained or unsatisfactorily explained, and why they all systematically fall apart and appear to be circular. The sort of proposed etymologies, explanations for seneh actually meaning thorn or bush or sharp, when examined systematically one by one, they all sort of end up being circular. Which means like this seneh must mean bush because the tradition says it means bush. And yeah, that you'll see what I mean as we go along. And once you remove the necessity that it has to mean bush, then you realize that there's essentially one candidate cognate, one candidate root word that does not mean anything related to bush, which emerges kind of as the strongest linguistic relative to seneh, and that it doesn't mean bush, like I said, and it supports my theory that this goes back to a pillar image originally instead, which has been forced into a conflation with these bush-related words. So let's see if I can make any clarity on the linguistic front as we go through this. So when we examine the lexical tradition that has supported the meaning of the Hebrew word seneh as either thorn, bush, sharp, or a meaning related to these, arguments for these connections appear in almost entirely circular, based on projecting the assumed meaning of thorn or bush where it is not supported, and then using that projection to support the same meaning in the underlying word seneh. Ultimately, all in the service of supporting the presumed thorn bush meaning which has been received, especially from the post-Septuagint biblical tradition. The scholars who have added support to these linguistic connections have sometimes even introduced false definitions to make things work toward this end. So these are red flags that pop up when you actually start to look even superficially at the proposed cognates of seneh. You'll see, as with the scholar Meissner, who proposes the word sinum or sinu, this Akkadian word sinu or sinum. He proposes this as a cognate, but he then, by a specious, by an irrelevant and I would say inaccurate or not actually parallel he tries to make a parallel with these two other words and saying, because of these two other words in how Aramaic developed, therefore sinum must mean the same as thornbush, as seneh, and by assuming that it's so circular, it's hard to even explain, but I'll go into this. Because of that, he says that this Akkadian word sinu meant thornbush or blackberry bush, but that's a false definition, and because of that, like in a circular way then supports seneh meaning thornbush. He's showing a history of the cognate for seneh meaning thornbush by projecting it onto that past Akkadian word, and then saying, look at this tradition of a similar cognate word meaning thornbush. and that creates the illusion of a web of meanings that are related. But this was back in 1800s that he did this, Meissner, and we actually have updated definitions of the Akkadian word seneh, and it doesn't. And in the official, CAD, the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, seneh, the Akkadian word, means a palm frond midrib. So there is a dictionary definition now, well established, that this word means palm frond midrib. Palm frond midrib is not a blackberry bush or a thorn bush in any sense, but this cognate, defined by Meissner by projecting the meaning of blackberry bush onto the Akkadian word, is then still used today to support seneh in a circular fashion, meaning thorn bush. And this is the lengths of the ridiculousness that is in this lexicographical tradition around this word. So even as as a lay person in terms of linguistics, I can just go to Meissner and see that he defines this Akkadian word seneh as blackberry bush, and in his argument for that, he says, because the Aramaic word seneh means thorn bush, and we can compare that to Hebrew seneh, and because these other two Aramaic words that he uses as a sort of false parallel of what happened, because of that, then seneh must mean blackberry bush, and that shows the continuity. And that, because Meissner was a prominent scholar, that entry from Meissner is used even today in Wiktionary to anchor this possible cognate, this possible definition of Hebrew seneh, meaning thorn bush. But we have now in the modern age, for a long time, the true definition of seneh, and it is a palm frond midrib. So the center pole, the central spar in a palm frond is the midrib, and that is what the Akkadian seneh meant. But Meissner was stretching things, and that left its imprint and its mark in the tradition, and that is used as support for the definition of seneh. Okay, so I will show you exactly what I mean from Wiktionary. So this is seneh, the word from the burning bush, and we see that it says the etymology is actually uncertain. This is key. Nobody actually knows, and there is no solid definition of seneh. That's why this is vulnerable. That's why this needs to be investigated. It's not actually, there is no scholarly consensus, so they try to throw out whatever possible similar word they can find that might mean something vaguely similar to a bush or a sharp thing, because they have the assumption that they're carrying into it that it must mean a bush or be connected to a thorn bush in some sense. But by projecting that assumption in there, it leads to them creating a circular argument over and over again, as we can see. So the cognates include the classical Syriac sanya, and that is classical Syriac, aka Aramaic. It is, they are continuous. I don't want to say aka, obviously, but classical Syriac and Aramaic are continuous related. If you look up the Aramaic word for this, it's sanya. It's the same. Okay, so yeah, you can see Aramaic. Here's the little definition there for that. Natively spoken in Syriac literature, and Aramaic is an Eastern Middle Aramaic dialect. So yeah, classical Syriac, to be more specific, it's a dialect of Aramaic, and I think time-wise, you would say classical Syriac is a bit later than what we think of as biblical Aramaic. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. But in any case, yeah, it's a dialect. So Aramaic, Syriac, we have sanya, meaning bramble thorn bush, and that's true. So this is kind of like the most prominent one that we want to look at as well, as another cognate that's thrown out. But then we have an Arabic word, sana or sena, which it's one of the weakest possible cognates, which I won't go into too much because this just it has a totally different meaning and spelling and everything like that. But then we also have the Akkadian senum, which Wiktionary to this day says means blackberry bush. But this is what I just talked about. It does not mean blackberry bush. There is no, this is why it's red. There is no Akkadian word senum that means blackberry bush. There is no, I can say this as a layperson, definitively, anyone can challenge this. There is no Akkadian word senum that means blackberry bush. This is based on the scholar Meissner in the 19th century, arguing that actually sinu, without an M, means, from Akkadian, means blackberry bush because he sees the Aramaic sanya, and he sees the Hebrew seneh, which he assumes must mean bush, and creating a circular argument based on those, and based on a specious parallel to how a couple of other Aramaic words were borrowed from Akkadian. He argues that sinum has to mean blackberry bush, and it follows this same pattern. But that's completely trumped and debunked and disproven by the modern Akkadian Assyrian dictionary, where sinu, S-I-N-U-M, also spelled Z-I-N-U-M, its dictionary definition means palm frond midrib. They've just, they have more information. They have disproven this. Or he's trying to argue that, oh, it really meant blackberry bush because I really want it to, because I want to project these Aramaic words back onto it. Whatever the case may be, this word does not mean blackberry bush. Only by a circular assertion can that be in place, but it's still there, trying to support this uncertain etymology to this day. And so if we can, how can I demonstrate this from the Assyrian dictionary? I'll just do a quick, a quick screenshot here. Bear with me one moment here, and this will be worth your time. So this is sinu, aka zinu, the S and the Z, it's the same word as it says in the entry as well. So go to my screenshots. All right, so this is from the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, and we have Z-I-N-U, also known as S-I-N-U, the very word that we just looked at. And what it means is midrib of the frond of the date palm, an ornament in the shape of a palm frond. So it can be either the midrib spar, the spear in the middle of a palm frond, or it can also be an ornament that is just a palm frond, that's sort of like a simplified, using the whole for the part, or using the whole palm frond, using the word for the part to refer to the whole, and this gives the idea for that. So I might have to continue this at a later date, like I said, but I will be just a moment. All right, so This is just not true. There's no sinew that means thorny bush. I'm talking about Akkadian here, so feel free to demonstrate that. And this is the word that Meissner is talking about. I will show you the screenshot right now, and this is what all, if sinew with two N's meant what you're saying, it would be included in Meissner and also Strong's Concordance. But as we can see here, as we can see, this is SINUM, one N. Okay. Also, I will show you the Meissner. Where do I have this? Bear with me. This is a complicated topic, but this is the quotation from Meissner himself in German. You can see that he's directly referencing the word SINU, not SINNU. Okay. And here he says SINIE, which is the plural form of SINU that I'm showing you from the Assyrian dictionary. He says that, in the Targums, the Aramaic Targums, the Aramaic word sanya and can be compared to the Hebrew word seneh. And he cites Emmanuel Lowe, who uses Aramaic text, so later than the Bible, to support this definition. So you can see he's referencing Emmanuel Lowe, who's using Aramaic Targum tradition, which has already decided the word means a thorn bush. He's using that to then support himself. This is once again circular data that he's bringing in. He then goes into this parallel from two other Akkadian words that were borrowed into Aramaic. And he says that because these words traveled this way, we should assume that Sinu also did. But to be very clear, this is Meissner. He's referring to SINIE, which is the plural of SINU that he mentions later in the passage. Okay, so, and that is why when you go to Strong's Concordance, it is referring to this right here. This is seneh, the burning bush word. It says a thorny bush, and look at Emmanuel Lowe. He says it right there. Well, Emmanuel Lowe is using Aramaic Targums, which are from centuries after the Septuagint, centuries after the tradition decided that this word must mean thorn bush. The conflation has already happened, so it's not useful for getting to the underlying root word in question. And then it says thorn bush, see Assyrian, that is Assyrian Akkadian, Sinu with one N, see Meissner, who says it means blackberry bush. Meissner thinks Aramaic sanya is a loan word from this. Okay, I just wanted to clarify, because someone in the comments said it's SINNU means bush. That's not what anyone in the biblical scholarly tradition is saying. They're not saying there's this different word, SINNU, that means bush. They're saying SINU means bush. But you can see this is from the 19th century, and it was a projection circularly that got retained in places like Brown Driver Briggs, has not been corrected. But you can look at the Assyrian dictionary yourself, and you can see SINU, also spelled with a Z, that's just interchangeable. It means there's no, you can look at the dictionary yourself. There's no second entry that means bush. There's absolutely no other mysterious entry that means bush. It is using this word, and it is completely taking the assumption that seneh must mean bush and projecting it circularly to try to reinforce itself. So you can't just say it's somewhere else in the dictionary. This is the word. And you can look for yourself. Okay, so Zinu or Sinu means midrib of the frond of the date palm, also an ornament in the shape of a palm frond. And this is tracing it to actually a Sumerian version, Gish Zena or Gish Zena. Very interesting. So there's a Sumerian version that was either parallel in time or a predecessor. It's hard to establish the exact relationship, but it seems like this Akkadian word could be an adaptation from a Sumerian predecessor that meant that was this gish zina. Okay, so yes, gish zina gishimar. Zinie, you can see the plural right here that Meissner refers to, Z-I-N-I-E. It is the exact word that Meissner has in his screenshot. Okay, midrib of the frond of the date palm, referring to the living tree. And what else? There's a lot of interesting information if you go through the whole thing. And then also called the Suma or Shuma Gishimaru, Zinu Ishina, etc. If a date palm has double midribs, but their base is single. Okay. So one other section I will pull up, and this will also be interesting. So this is the rest right here of the dictionary entry. You can take a look. 1 second, I gotta take a look here. Okay. All right, thanks. Okay, so let's take a look. Referring to the midrib as working material, so it could also refer, it was a construction material used for doors and parts of houses, because it was a support. It had a strong support. It's like if you look at a palm frond, there are these giant leaf fronds, right, with these very large central sort of spear down the middle of the leaf that is actually quite strong. So because of that, it was used as sort of supporting material in some types of construction. And that goes back to the fact that it is a pillar, it is a symbolic pillar image. Okay, so yeah, you can see it's being used in different contexts there. A door made out of palm ribs. And they also had this ornament made in the shape of a palm frond that had some kind of, it had some kind of symbolic meaning to them, because there was a jewel ornament that they would make out of this image of the Sinu. Okay. Also the libu, or the hearts of the trees, libu, as we can see. This word is potentially connected to the heart of fire that appears in the seneh, but that is another tangent. They are thick and tough, and yeah, the midrib of the frond from the top of the tree. The identification of the ornament attested. Okay, so that is that's the important part of that. Okay, so we've taken a look at the direct Meissner quotation that you can look up for yourself in his book, and that is the source of. Just this gets repeated that Sinu means blackberry bush, but if you read what he actually says, he's making an argument that it could mean that because of these transformations in other Aramaic words from Akkadian. There is nothing that he's basing that on, and it is debunked by the modern CAD, the Assyrian dictionary. So to go through that a little bit more, I'll read through this. Perhaps most foundational for the modern lexical tradition of this word, Bruno Meissner concludes that the Akkadian sinu must have meant blackberry bush, and that this was borrowed into Aramaic as sanya. To reach this conclusion, he uses a specious, meaning a doubtful, a invalid, and ultimately irrelevant partial parallel to another pair of words that are Akkadian ninu and Aramaic ninya, to argue that Akkadian sinu would become Aramaic sanya, or also written as SN, aleph apostrophe, so which he and the tradition that follows relate to Hebrew seneh. Okay, so you see that he is making an argument that words that end with this long U from Akkadian go down this path and transform into Aramaic words that look like a certain way, meaning niña. He's saying words that start with this form, in, then long u, from Akkadian should turn into this in, this having this ya ending, this ya, or rather, in the original spelling, of course. He says, because we know that this Akkadian ninu turns into niña, therefore we should think that Akkadian sinu turns into sanya. Okay, right? You can see already that sanya, it's actually not identical to niña. So it's what you would say is this is a possible parallel that could support that, but it's nothing definitive. And so it's something to be questioned. And like I said, the lexicographical, the dictionary tradition of the Assyrian dictionary in the modern day has a completely different well-established definition for sinu. So it kind of negates his argument, even though it's left to stand. I think it's left to stand because it's like saying, well, who knows? Maybe there was a connection to blackberry bush. Maybe scholars are just thinking, well, maybe there was some blackberry connection, and maybe it's still useful to think about how the palm frond word could have become the bush word in Hebrew. They leave these things open because they can't say definitively one way or another. But what they can say definitively is that the technical definition of Akkadian sinu was palm frond midrib, and it's very clear because they have a bunch of attestations, and they have it spelled with S and also Z, and the plural as well. Okay, so here is the the AI translation of Meissner from the German to give you the direct argument of how he made this argument, and why it's ultimately circular. He's projecting in some assumptions while using an imperfect parallel from two different Aramaic borrowings from Akkadian. So he says, quote, SINIE, that is the plural of sinu, is in any case to be equated with Aramaic sanya, for which the form Hebrew seneh, or rather, this is actually Aramaic, because in the Aramaic tradition they use both. Okay, so I apologize, but this is the what he's saying is seneh obviously is the Hebrew version, but it also appears in Aramaic with that spelling, if what I'm saying makes sense. He's saying that the in the Aramaic targums, which are the commentaries on the Bible, they inherit this word, and the targums equate sanya, their word for thorn bush. They equate that with the seneh spelling, okay, implying that they're one and the same. And he cites for this Emmanuel Lowe, who is writing on botany and plants, and the technical categorization and history and etymology of these plants. But it has to be noted that Emmanuel Lowe, as he says here, is citing the Aramaic targums, which are not giving us the earliest picture of the history of this word. They're giving us a history where it has been accepted that seneh from the Bible, from the Hebrew Bible, is used interchangeably with sanya. So that all it tells us is what they were doing in the tradition post-Bible. It's interesting, but it cannot be used to support the underlying etymology in a definitive sense. So then Meissner says, the meaning blackberry bush also fits quite well. Okay, so you can see this is not definitive. He's not saying, I have a dictionary in front of me where seneh definitely means blackberry bush. He's not saying, I'm looking at tablets from Akkadian right in front of me where there's a picture of a blackberry bush, and this word seneh definitely, or sinu, or what have you, means blackberry bush. He's making an argument based on, you can see the foundation is that he has sanya from Aramaic, and he has seneh being used interchangeably with it in the Aramaic Targums, and those are being treated as meaning blackberry, or rather thorn bush in that tradition. And so he then says the meaning for the Akkadian word blackberry bush fits quite well. Okay, that's a great argument, but that's just a statement. It's just like you can see he's connecting ideas together, but he does not have proof of this. This form, as well as ninu, which turns into the Aramaic ninya. Ninu equals ninya. So Akkadian ninu equals Aramaic ninya. Further below, so he's saying the borrowing of Akkadian ninu into Aramaic ninya, turns into that, proves that these Aramaic words are borrowed from Assyrian. Okay, so, well, rather he's establishing that they are borrowed from Assyrian, I should say, in this pattern. If both forms of formation were identical, so he's saying if the formation of the Aramaic seneh was identical to the formation of Aramaic ninya, then the words in question in Assyrian would have to sound like sinu, ninu, for sinu, ninu. Okay, different spellings. His point is he's using a parallel of this Akkadian borrowing ninu to ninya, and he's saying if the formation was identical for sanya, or what? Well, you can see for yourself what he's saying. He's making a parallel. If the formations were identical, then the original Assyrian Akkadian word would have to sound like sinu, just like we have ninu. So he says, long U at the end is often rendered in Aramaic loanwords by ending ya. See also nedunya, unquote. Okay, so he's trying to make a parallel argument to support his pre-existing data from the Aramaic Targums that conflates sanya and seneh. He's making he's projecting the conflation, or the assumption, the tradition rather, in the Targums that seneh is the same as sanya and they mean thorn bush. He's projecting that back to say, therefore, the predecessor of sanya should look like sinu, to match what happened with ninu turning into ninya. Okay. Now that's like an interesting argument, but nothing about that is proof or definitive. And not only that, we can obviously see that there are different sounds, like the first vowel is different in both. Ninya versus sanya is different. But when you break these down into the actual Aramaic lettering, they're quite different. This Aramaic ninya, I apologize, it doesn't actually parallel the same, the identical, amount of letters. It's not like an exact one-to-one is my point. It's not an exact one-to-one, meaning that it's like a possible parallel, but it's at the end of the day, a specious parallel. It's irrelevant in terms of proof, and it's superseded, it's debunked by the modern definitions we have in the modern Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, defining this sinu word as palm frond midrib instead. So it's just, he tried to make a parallel based on how borrowings sometimes transform, and he used words that were similar but not identical in form to the one in question to make that argument. And none of that was definitive, but it's somehow been retained in the lexicographical tradition as a support for the ultimate argument that seneh really does mean thorn bush. Okay, so pay close attention to the parallel that he attempts to set up to support this argument. Aramaic sanya is not a perfect parallel to his proposed parallel Aramaic ninya, and thus there's no reason that the Akkadian predecessor of Aramaic ninya, which is ninu, should be a solid parallel for deducing the Akkadian parallel of Aramaic sanya. In fact, quite the contrary. Because the consonantal pattern of Niña is significantly different, so because the pattern of the letters in the words that are being used as parallels are actually sort of just like different. They're just a different order. Why should they be compared? Because of that, we should not expect them to transform in the identical pattern. Okay, like yeah, it's just not evidentially telling us like the shape of the words are actually more different than what he's letting on, is what I'm saying. And one example of this is the different resulting vowel patterns, meaning that I pointed out, sanya versus niña, okay, I versus a. But that is reflected in, of course, the Aramaic vowels as well. So therefore, Akkadian Sinu, which is in a closer consonantal vowel pattern alignment with Ninu. So I'm accepting, Sinu and Ninu, they're in very close, pattern. The pattern of the words you can see are very parallel, with a difference of the first consonant. It should not be expected that Sinu turns into Sanya if Ninu turns into Niña. You see what I'm saying? Why? Yeah. It just does not follow. It's sort of a non sequitur, or just not evidentially supported by the claim. It is an interesting parallel that could have merit if there was more to show that this really happened, but it does not tell that story on its own. It should not be the expected Akkadian predecessor of the Aramaic Sanya, by Meissner's own given examples, which show the pattern of Ninu becoming Niña. Okay, so this is just a little breakdown of, if you look at these parallel words that he's trying to use as like his whole evidence that this could have happened, why not break them down into their Aramaic consonantal vowel patterns and see that the whole point of doing this is not to like do some deep linguistics, actually. It's just to show like anyone can see that the letters actually are in a different pattern. So why should one transform identically to the other in parallel? It could happen if you had more proof, but it does not follow as proof in itself. So the Aramaic Sanya has the, these are the consonants in Aramaic, which cash out to this in English. Essentially, it has three consonants with one yod. In terms of the transliteration, the first vowel is A in the vowel position, and that comes through with vowel pointing in that case. And so he's trying to treat Sanya as sort of identical in form to Niña, the Aramaic, to use it as a parallel, right? But look at the difference, okay? Like anyone who actually knows the linguistics can see that these are slightly different in form. And you can see that it is, N, Y, N, Y. Okay, so yes, three consonants with two yods. It's a different pattern. In terms of the transliteration, the first vowel is an I, as we've pointed out multiple times, and that comes from the extra yod in comparison to, that's what I mean, relative to Sanya. So there's an extra yod in the word Niña here, relative to Sanya that it's being that's being compared to, right? So yeah, why should this word that has a whole extra yod there be exactly comparable to this Sanya that does not have that extra yod? In the English spelling, they look so similar, but actually, when you break it down, there's an extra yod in, as well as a different vowel. Okay, that's kind of the summary of all it really needs to be said. They are just not identical. They are similar, but not identical. So as a result, the SNY apostrophe is not perfectly comparable to the lettering of Niña. Sanya is not perfectly comparable to Niña in their Aramaic spellings. And we cannot expect the identical transformation to have produced Sanya from Sinu that produced Niña from Ninu. The supposed parallel between Niña and Sanya is then an illusion, or at best a loose suggestion. Like I said, it could have happened, anything in this terms that like anything can happen, but you would need more proof that happened. It doesn't prove it on its own. coincidental endings with only partial morphological relationship. So this undermines Meissner's use of Nina as a parallel to validate the seneh etymology, connecting it back to Akkadian Sinu. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. It's really not that complicated, and I'm not trying to do deep linguistic analysis where I shouldn't, but you can see for yourself that there's an extra yod as well as a different vowel, and just any layperson can see that this is, from his passage, this is the foundational piece of evidence for the comparison. He's using a parallel from borrowings from Akkadian to Aramaic, but that parallel does not hold 100%. It's actually not the same. It's and on top of all of that, the modern CID, the Assyrian dictionary, proves that this word sinu never did mean blackberry bush, like Meissner wants to assert, and we can see it happening, that he's just projecting that meaning from the Aramaic sanya, which is bound up with and being conflated with seneh in the Targums. It's all right there. You can see what happened for yourself. I'm just hopefully pointing the direction to that, to anyone who wants to investigate that in a scholarly fashion. Okay, so this is just a bit more possible things to question about that, which I have a question mark here because this is not like a definitive statement, but something worth considering. The positional relationship between the two ends is preserved between Ninu and Ninya, but the positionality of the letters shifts because there's a different number of letters, basically, relative to the root. So this gets a bit more convoluted, complex, but something to consider that just drives home the same point I've been saying. The words being used as parallels are not perfect parallels, because the endings of Ninya and Sanya are actually in a different position in relation to the root. So the derivation of the sort of endings actually has a different logic in both words. They're not being derived, the endings are not being formed from the same logical linguistic pattern. And you can see that if you see the position of them. Okay, this is an extra yod added to a borrowed word to make it act more like an Aramaic word for ninya. But in the case of sanya, the yod is part of the core of the word, represented as SNY, SN apostrophe. And so Meissner's claim of borrowing implies that the borrowed long U of sinu would have become the hard glottal stop of the sanya ending, because we can see that the sanya ending, in this case, the ya ending, is not a mere extension as had been the case with ninya. So hopefully that is just simple enough, clear enough. Like the ending of ninya, it's an extension of sorts, whereas in sanya, it is, well, it's not a mere extension. It's more part of the core of the word. The fact that the yod is extra in the case of ninya, that it is not the same slot in the word sanya, it's more severe and brings into question this whole parallel that he's trying to use. If this parallel he was saying, was suggesting, was not so load-bearing for his entire argument, it might be an interesting possibility supporting this having happened historically, but it's so load-bearing that it falls apart when you realize the words are actually different. And hopefully that spells it out well enough to get the ball rolling and to get more investigation on that. So this sort of imprecise parallel might be of interest if there was independent other reason to confirm the derivation for sanya from sinu. But in this case, Meissner is trying to generate the evidence for the derivation from this imprecise parallel itself, while using as his secondary support evidence from Emmanuel Lowe, which is itself based on Aramaic Targums that well postdate the Septuagint in the versions we have, of course, and so are already influenced by the conflation, or cannot be disentangled, cannot be known whether they give us a snapshot of anything earlier than Septuagint. So they are already, can be assumed to be, or are at least vitiated. They are in question regarding whether they are already doing the conflation that is under investigation between sanya and seneh in the received biblical tradition. So the point is, the possibility is out in the air now that they may have, in the received biblical tradition from the Septuagint onward at least, they had decided that seneh from the Bible was the same as sanya, the Aramaic word for thorn bush, and that those were variations, Hebrew versus Aramaic versions of the same word, basically, or cousin words, and therefore they use them interchangeably. But if that shows up happening in the Aramaic Targums, it just means that they're accepting the received tradition post-Septuagint. It doesn't tell us that those were always the same word for all time and originally, and what their root was. So therefore, Emmanuel Lowe being brought in with his Aramaic evidence doesn't tell us anything that escapes the possibility of circularity being brought in. It's the possibility that he's just bringing in circular evidence to then re-support seneh, meaning blackberry bush, but from using evidence that's post the potential conflation. That is the definition of possibly circular, and therefore not reliable, not reliable enough for the very question that is at hand. So therefore, the parallel of ninya to sanya that Meissner pushes and uses is entirely irrelevant to the meaning of both sinu and seneh. It cannot demonstrate that sinu became sanya, at least on its own. In fact, it casts some doubt on that possibility by the evident mismatch of the paralleled pairs. So if ninya actually is a different form of word, a different shape, and different logic to its derivation from sanya, then it casts doubt on the fact that they both came from, parallel shaped words in Akkadian, sinu and ninu, right? Like actually cast doubt on it. Why would ninu and sinu, which actually are very similar and parallel, why would they transform confidently into these actually different shaped words? Okay, it actually casts doubt. It doesn't disprove it either, like I said, but it is not, it is casting doubt. More doubt is being accrued. Because a meaning of thorn bush is secondarily associated with this Aramaic word sanya, which does have the meaning of thorn bush. Let's see. Because a meaning of thorn bush is secondarily associated with this Aramaic word sanya, i.e. thorn bush, is sanya's secondary but not primary meaning, Meissner then uses his own suspect parallel of sanya to sinu to say that Akkadian sinu originally meant blackberry bush. And we just saw this all unfold in his very passage. He was using Aramaic sanya as the real anchor point of the entire, the possibility that sinu means blackberry bush at all. He was using Aramaic sanya as that anchor point to build that supposition up. However, this is like the next big bombshell of this incredible investigation. Aramaic sanya does not primarily mean thorn bush. It's a secondary extension or secondary derived meaning, a symbolic meaning derived from its actual root meaning. The root meaning of sanya never meant thorn bush or anything specifically botanical. The root of sanya in Aramaic means to hate or hated. So it's this word meaning something hateful or hated. And that's the actual word. If we're looking at roots and we're trying to say this word came from this other word, you have to actually look at the root. So if there was an Akkadian word, sinu, meaning thorn bush, why would it transform into an Aramaic word that actually its fundamental meaning, its root meaning is to hate? And that was extended within Aramaic tradition to mean thorn bush by a symbolic literary extension, essentially, where the thorn bush was poetically called the hated thing, the hated or hateful one. Okay. And so this is the next key thing to understand. This is such a house of cards. This entire string of circular reasoning is such a house of cards that the whole anchor point that Meissner and others were using, this Aramaic word sanya, even it fundamentally does not mean anything related to thorn bush. It meant to hate, or the verb hate, or the verb to hate, essentially. And that was extended in that tradition to be a name for the thorn bush, and that became the literary name for the thorn bush in that tradition was the hated one, or the hateful one. And you can imagine that because a thorn bush has thorns, it is either hated by everyone, or it is seen as symbolically full of hate with its sharp thorns, right? That was the literary poetic process that was happening from the simple verb meaning to hate. It became extended to refer to thorn bushes, especially in some literary contexts. Okay, so that cannot, that fundamental word that we know has this history cannot be deriving from an Akkadian word that means thorn bush. The whole thing is a house of cards, once again debunked by the modern meaning of Akkadian seneh. So that was all suspect, and that cannot actually be used to support Akkadian seneh, meaning blackberry bush. Scholars following Meissner then use this circularly generated meaning of Akkadian seneh to support a vague word family. So just think about this. The main anchors that we saw on Wiktionary, for example, the main anchor cognates, suggested cognates, were Akkadian sinum, which is actually this Meissner word seneh. It actually means palm frond midrib, which has been circularly generated from seneh and other pieces that he put together to try to force this definition. But then the second one is seneh itself, this major anchor of the whole support for this meaning. But Aramaic seneh only means thorn bush secondarily, poetically, as an extension from its actual root meaning, which is to hate. And that is also well known and well established in the linguistic tradition. People know this, but they think, well, maybe something happened here. Maybe there's like maybe like the meaning carried over here and was borrowed here. It's a house of cards, though. It's very not strong, which is why Wiktionary and elsewhere will admit that the meaning of seneh, it's actually not known. They don't want to say this confidently because actually the link to even seneh, it's very questionable. Why should this Hebrew word that means thorn bush be definitively like coming from a shared root with this word that actually means to hate? It could have happened, right? It could have happened where they both developed this meaning to hate, and that, or rather, the word for to hate both developed to mean the sharp thorn bush. That's perfectly fine, but it does not support this sort of deep web of roots meaning the same thing, which they're trying to push with sort of like the borrowing from Akkadian supporting that. Okay, so yes, they try to use this to support a vague word family, an actual word family, as if seneh simply meant thorn bush, and as if there was. See, this is the thing. If you look at Wiktionary, it'll say like maybe there's this root of seneh that meant sharp, right, or something like that. But you can see that that's not possible if you're paralleling it to Aramaic seneh, that means in its root means to hate. You'd have to say there's a root for Hebrew seneh that means to hate, and that they come from some root meaning to hate. If you want to relate those, you can't have Hebrew seneh coming from a different root meaning sharp or thorn, and then seneh coming from one meaning to hate and only secondarily, and those being related. That it's all broken links trying to be forced together into a house of cards. So it's like one or the other, but they try to it seems like people are trying to generate as many possibilities to support the existing tradition that it had to mean bush. So scholars following Meissner then use this circularly generated meaning of Akkadian seneh to support a vague word family posited from an SN root, so a Hebrew root with SN as the consonants, that can be supposed, or rather a Semitic root of some kind, whatever they can theoretically posit, that can be supposed to then yield thornbush related words in a kind of vague web, imagining that these words can then underlie the more mysterious Hebrew seneh. So as it stands today, we have sufficient Akkadian Assyrian evidence, and the CAD dictionary is clear that Akkadian seneh means palm frond midrib, not thorn/bush, as Meissner attempted to imply by his back projecting definition and imprecise parallel examples, we can then say that Meissner was reading the received meaning of thornbush into the Akkadian Sinu. I think that's pretty evident via his irrelevant linguistic parallel of Ninu is to Nina as Sinu is to Sanya, or Ninu is borrowed into Nina as Sinu would be borrowed into Sanya, as he says. All this together created the illusion of a thornbush word family going back to Akkadian and continuing into Aramaic, which has been used to imply a related thornbush background for the Hebrew word seneh. But once again, each step is either circular or it is contradictory, a sort of broken link that can't work. As aforementioned, Emmanuel Lowe, who Meissner cites in order to give the appearance of solidifying the thornbush meaning for Hebrew seneh, bases his interpretation of the word on post-Septuagint Aramaic targums, in which seneh is already being conflated with this Aramaic sanya. This already tainted evidence then expectedly supports seneh being connected to sanya, because they've already accepted it in that tradition that it means the same. But this is again entirely circular, or potentially circular, due to the tradition being already affected by the theoretical conflation of the words, I should say. So theoretically being affected. This is the issue in question, so that evidence cannot be admitted because it is the very question at issue. Lowe looks to the Targums for the meaning of Hebrew seneh. They already treat them as interchangeable. And he concludes from that seneh meant the same as sanya originally, but this is not a snapshot of the original time, of the original meaning of seneh on its own. Never getting to a point far enough back in time where seneh can be assessed on its own terms without possible contamination from the meaning of sanya. This point should be clear. The Targum tradition Lowe relies on comes after the identification of these words in the biblical tradition, which is the very point at issue, as being what the original meaning of seneh was in itself. The Targum tradition does not give us any clear information about the original meaning of seneh prior to its Septuagint definition as thornbush, and its conflation or potential conflation with sanya in the Aramaic tradition. Instead, Lowe gets out of the Targums what was put into them, namely an early conflation. In my theory, my theory here, of course, an early conflation of the words seneh and sanya that, because unchallenged, became authoritative. So it's just the tradition. He's just receiving the tradition and repeating that, which is not evidence for the earlier original meaning in itself. So crucially for this issue, the Aramaic word sanya does not itself mean thornbush, as I stated, in a literal sense, and does not come from a root meaning thornbush or anything related in a literal sense, such as thorn, sharp, plant, etc. None of that. All of that is actually, I wouldn't say off the table, but none of it is supported for the underlying original meaning. It instead comes from a root meaning to hate and was applied figuratively to the speaking thornbush now, found in the sayings of Ahikar. So there's a certain text of the Ahikar story, which is Aramaic text, but there's a certain part of the text, or a certain separate text that goes along with companion part of the text called the sayings of Ahikar. And in that text, there is famously a speaking thornbush. And it is a parable, essentially, being told about a speaking thornbush and a speaking pomegranate tree. And the thornbush is called the sanya. So right there you have, but in that story, it's more clear, or in that, rather, if you look at the linguistic tradition, that is just the word for the hated one being applied to this speaking thornbush to describe his character, his role in the parallel, and his symbolic associations, that he is embodying this hated one, this hated, hateful thing. And so it's just a name. It is just the speaking thornbush being called the hated one. And therefore, either before this Ahikar text or thereafter, the word for the hated, the hateful, the hated, was used as a name for thorn bushes. But being used as a name does not mean the root of the word means thorn bush, right? Okay, so seneh means thorn bush only insofar as the thorn bush is the hateful one, more fundamentally. The meaning of thorn bush that subsequently became attached to the word seneh in the tradition, as the Aramaic lexical data supports, is a secondary and figurative extension of the fundamental meaning to hate. Seneh's earliest recorded use for a thorn bush is the passage naming the thorn bush from Ahikar. This is, again, I said, the meaning of thorn bush for seneh may have just been subsequent to its appearance in Ahikar as that, or it could have existed prior in the tradition as just a poetic term for a thorn bush, right? However, the earliest attestation we have of the word seneh in Aramaic texts at all is in this sayings of Ahikar, where it is a talking thorn bush being called the hated one, hateful one. Okay, so seneh's earliest recorded use for thorn bush is in the passage naming the thorn bush from Ahikar, but its root meaning nonetheless is and was to hate. So there is absolutely no external previous instances of this word seneh just meaning like thorn bush or thorn on its own. It's only here, like the basis of it, in like a more neutral sense or something, right? The basis of it is this character who is this speaking thorn bush who is embodying the traits of the hated one in his parable. Okay, so that is the source. Rather than there being like a bunch of other evidence where the word just means thorn bush on its own, that's not true. It has an earliest instance, and you can see thereafter the seneh gets used as a label, as a name for the thorn bush in the Aramaic tradition, as well as the Targum tradition. But you can trace it to its earliest attestation, and it all stems from the Ahikar talking thorn bush, who is the hated one. So, therefore, it is not plausible that seneh, spelled this way, S-N apostrophe like that in English, and seneh would come from a shared root meaning thorn or thorn bush. So because the root of seneh, Aramaic, actually means to hate, it's not plausible that seneh, Aramaic, and seneh in the Hebrew would come from some shared root meaning thorn or thorn bush. Thorn bush is the secondary extension poetically of to hate for seneh. So that can't be the root word meaning. I mean, without much stronger evidence that the meanings just flipped in that way, or something. There would have to be some extravagant evidence, or very strong evidence to show that it magically came from a thorn bush, which was extended to mean hate, which then was okay. Like to show that thorn or thorn bush was the primary meaning would go against everything we have in the lexical tradition, where seneh, or this root sn apostrophe, this root just means to hate. It's the verb to hate, and it's used outside of thorn bush contexts in the Aramaic tradition. So sn apostrophe in itself means to hate and does not derive from an earlier root meaning thorn/bush, leaving for us with our possible cognates of seneh, leaving no related thorn bush root for seneh to supposedly also derive from. The projection and circularity here on the part of those wishing to tie seneh to seneh via a shared meaning of thorn bush becomes very blatant. Like when you just look closely at the words, the circularity just comes out to you quite clearly. And it pushes against the lexical information that we have for each word. We have lexical information in the dictionaries for Aramaic seneh, that it means to hate fundamentally. We have lexical information for the Akkadian sinu, that it means palm frond midrib fundamentally. Okay, so trying to then just say, because we want the Hebrew word seneh to mean something related to bush, to just say, maybe Aramaic sanya originally meant thorn, something sharp, thorn instead, and maybe the Akkadian sinew actually, palm frond, maybe it was like more like a generic bush that became palm frond. Like that's all. That's if you wanted to argue that, that's all because you're trying to force what you want to have happened, what you want the tradition of this word to be, essentially, trying to project that completely contrary to the lexical information we have for those words. So you're pushing against the current of the actual data and evidence about Aramaic Sanya and Akkadian Sinu, which are the strongest possible cognates for seneh. Furthermore, linguistically, Sanya comes from this SN root, while seneh would come from a different reconstructible root, SNH. So you can see here, let's see. Okay, so 1 second. You can see that the roots are pretty clear. The sanya root is clear, whereas the root for seneh in Hebrew has to be projected and reconstructed because we just have the word, and it is a one-time existing word, as we know, and that's why it's mysterious. As a result of that, this is why it says uncertain, possibly from the unused root. Unused root. Okay, so this is the unused root that they are guessing could have been there. That's all they're saying. But it is just a guess based on the meaning and based on these similar words that they're saying could have been related, which you can deconstruct when you look closely at each one of them. That's the point. But ultimately, the Hebrew seneh, it does not have this same ending that, let's look at sanya. This is the Aramaic one, right? So yeah, compare it to this, but you can see that the ending letter is actually different glottal stop, SNY. Here's the SNY spelling. That's the simplified spelling, which also in English is transliterated SN apostrophe, same word. Yeah, so concordance. And you can find the earliest usage of this, and it goes back to in the texts that we have, extant texts, the Aramaic Ahikar sayings, like I said. So as a result, these are clearly not the same roots, and no one would say these are the same roots, right? Sanya and seneh, linguistically. There's a notable barrier between the SN apostrophe and SNH in the English transliterations, of course, and thus between sanya and seneh. In theories that assume their relation, it is not explained how the difference between this final aleph and final H is bridged. So, okay, we have this right here. Okay, so you get the idea, hopefully, of that. So how is that bridged? How is that ya in the Aramaic, which is said in a more glottal stop kind of way, in the actual pronunciation? How is that bridged to the sort of final H, the more silent, vowel holder sound at the end of seneh? How is that bridged in their roots beyond assuming that there is a relation in the beginning? there's actually a bit of more difficulty going between those two sounds linguistically. Some other words relating to sharpness and pointedness have been gathered to try to shore up this insecure definition of seneh and to attempt to tie it to meanings vaguely in the orbit of thorns, as if by piling enough unconnected yet suggestively similar words together, the pile can act as a distraction from the fundamental gaps between any of the individual words and the word seneh itself. The other word most often thrown in to add sharp words to the pile is shin, tooth, which I think we're looking at here. So you can see this Proto-Semitic reconstructed word shin, meaning tooth, but it has the sh sound here. It's a different letter, a different sibilant, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not gonna go too much into that, but you can see for yourself, it goes back to a different Akkadian word, completely a different Akkadian word. The sh with this accent over the s, sh, it is not the same as the Hebrew seneh, the s. Okay, so but there is a separate Akkadian word meaning tooth, elephant, tusk, teeth, ivory. It's a different word. It's not the Akkadian word that we looked at with the single N that we would be most interested in. The different sibilant, making it an sh sound, shinum, and the double N there, those are actually major differences that make this quite an unlikely jump. Okay, so it is not. It is like a similar word, but it's like shinum with a double N versus seneh with the soft S and the single N. Yeah, so let's keep going here. Shin, tooth, as if perhaps the meaning of tooth and that of hate might have originally come from an SN root family that generated a broad spray of sharp point related words. This is what they want to sort of vaguely project, but keep as vague as possible. Anyone who wants to support these possible meanings. I'm not saying this is like a malicious thing that's done, but anyone who's taking the angle that this is a probable set of similar cognates that are actually related, they are suggesting that there is some vague SN root that generated this broad spray of sharp pointed related words, but this goes against the lexical data that we have. This makes little sense, considering that sanya does not mean thornbush fundamentally, but instead hate. And finally, shin has the entirely different sibilant, which is shin, as well as gemination, or the double N, not found in seneh or sanya. So shen also is another one, and that thus comes from a root entirely distinct from seneh and also from sanya, separated from them by this different sibilant, as well as the quite different meanings. And the meanings have to be taken into account too, okay, right? It did everything, tooth is once again a different, it's like, oh, maybe tooth, it's like a similar thing to a thornbush because they have sharpness. It's a leap that they're trying to bridge, and it could be bridged, but it's not being bridged. It's being left in this incredibly vague cloud of maybe something derived, but why? Why force that? Because we have to assume that seneh means bush and thornbush. The pieces are not fitting together then because they just don't fit together. The fascinating thing is that none of the proposed related words actually mean thorn or bush. None of the proposed cognates on, for example, Wiktionary or Strong's or Brown Driver Briggs concordance, none of the proposed related words actually mean thorn or bush in themselves or in their roots. Like that should be, just dwell on that for a moment. And thus it appears a venture of powerful imagination to suppose an earlier root meaning sharp or thorn that yields the words for hate and also teeth, or any of these together at once. As such, the assumption that seneh means thornbush in the first place is the lone anchor. So the assumption gotten from the tradition that seneh just means thornbush. That's an assumption from the tradition. That assumption itself is the lone anchor giving any credence to the supposition of such a deeper root that could have given rise to all these variant roots or words. But that assumed meaning is what is at issue, and the analysis of the proposed related words reveals the extent to which the entire claim that seneh has a linguistic basis to mean thorn bush is based on circular reasoning from the biblical received assumption that it means thorn bush. It just does. Therefore, find the similar words. They must have been connected somehow, even if none of it makes sense and we can't actually make the links. Just keep assuming it because it must. That is deconstructed by looking at them individually, seeing that it is a house of cards based on a bunch of circular projections, and having the mythological parallel from the Indian text that shows that there was actually a totally different meaning that is stronger and explains things without these leaps and without contradiction. If the Exodus-based assumption is that it simply meant thornbush originally is just removed or put in doubt, put on hold, the house of cards has no linguistic basis in itself to keep it from collapsing. This suggests that the reason seneh has persistently been read as somehow meaning thorn/bush, despite the gaps between it and words that have such meanings or similar meanings, is that there is no clear alternative, and that therefore, if the received biblical tradition says seneh is a thorn bush, we should assume it is close enough to the loosely associated thorn bush words. And I just think anybody looking at this honestly will realize that's true, that you're just saying, well, the Bible is right about, or the biblical tradition rather, not the Bible itself. This isn't even talking about what the Bible says about itself. Okay, that's what's important. This is talking about the translation or the meaning that was just accepted or built up within the tradition that developed, the interpretive tradition of what that Hebrew word meant, came to accept that it was the same as the Aramaic word. That's not, the Bible doesn't label it itself and say, this is definitely a bush, That's what's interesting. But I think anyone who looks at this can see that what they're doing, what anyone is doing is saying, well, the strongest source of information about this that we have is the biblical tradition itself. Therefore, we should just assume that it must be right somehow, and that words change. So if we have the group of vaguely similar words that could be connected, that creates a web of possible linguistic words that could be could have given rise to this meaning, and we should just assume that it means bush. There's nothing to challenge it. But with the Indian parallel, there is a real challenge that gives us reason to push against that and to say, actually, that's not good enough. Linguistically, that falls apart. And mythologically, there is an explanation for this exact word. Okay. So this is an assumption that has no warrant and appears increasingly suspect. In short, there has never been any motivation to look for an alternative despite the questionable gaps we have highlighted and the circular projections from false cognates like sanya, sina, and shin have been good enough to satisfy curiosity. However, the evidence of widespread Indian influence on Exodus and Genesis changes our motivation radically, or it should. We now have urgent reason to ask whether the word originally meant bush at all, or when it was changed to be understood as bush. If we can reasonably argue that the source of the Exodus story of the seneh originally featured a linga and pillar, if that's the source story, linga and pillar, and we can support that through parallels, then we must investigate the possibility that a change to the meaning of this word for bush, rather, a change to the meaning of seneh to define it as bush, happened at some point in the word's history. Whether in the composition process itself, it could have the word could have been brought in and redefined as that in the very composition process itself, or in the reception of the text thereafter. So there's the possibility that seneh never meant bush or anything related in its original meaning. Whoever wrote that word down, nothing linguistically about it tells us that it definitely or really should have meant bush or thorn or sharp or anything like that. And so there's the possibility that it was the people thereafter reading the Bible and the tradition that grew up, um, re-evaluated, retranslated, or when they tried to understand what that original text was saying, they redefined it in terms of a word they knew from Aramaic, which was sanya, which had the secondary, not primary meaning of thorn bush. And that in that process, they conflated the Hebrew, this more mysterious Hebrew word seneh, with the Aramaic sanya, and just treated it as meaning thorn bush. This could have happened accidentally or on purpose if they wanted to change what the original meaning was for theological reasons. So as such, because of this parallel evidence, the word seneh becomes a site of suspicion. As mentioned, Meissner connected Akkadian sinu to Aramaic sanya, which was a forced fit, as we saw, supported by a pair of imprecise parallels. And the upshot of this dubious connection, which projects the meaning of blackberry bush back onto the Akkadian sinu, is then used to support Hebrew seneh falling into this group of imagined thornbush words as well. So what I mean by that is Meissner's argument is used in Wiktionary and in Brown Driver Briggs to support seneh, meaning blackberry bush. But that was a circular argument in the first place, which is now being used to support seneh. It's just wild, really. However, if we look at seneh, it looks much closer to this Akkadian sinu. So what I would like to posit is that of all these words that we can deconstruct all the cognates, shinum kind of falls apart. It has the s, it has the sh sound, right? Shin sibilant, as well as the gemination, the double n, and means tooth. It's quite different in these three different ways. Sanya has this fundamental meaning that is actually to hate. So that's a bit vague. It could be connected, but it also has this different ending. This ya ending is seriously different from the ending, the h or what have you. They are different endings and come from different roots. When you kind of deconstruct those primary candidates, right, cognate candidates for the related words to the Hebrew seneh, the Akkadian sinu actually still stands as a strong possibility. Nothing about sinu disqualifies it from being related to seneh in the same ways that we just touched on. It has this, has this same single n. It has a similar vowel consonant pattern, right? In its own, it's not. I'm not saying it's identical, because it's not. And it has, the s. So, and on top of that, a scholar of the caliber of Meissner himself was trying to connect that Akkadian word to it. So, this is not just me saying it. Meissner saw something about sinu that seemed linguistically relatable to both the Hebrew and Aramaic words. Therefore, it's actually, to me, it's left to us as the strongest standing possible candidate that should be investigated. So because, what's equivalent saying? So it's stronger than either. What am I saying? The very word Meissner proposed as the ancestor of sanya and equivalent of seneh. So seneh looks closer to Akkadian sinu than either sanya or sinu appear to sanya. Okay, so apologize. That's confusingly worded, but I'm saying that it is a better possible parallel than even what Meissner was trying to draw from sinu to sanya by his questionable parallel. The Akkadian word sinu, also sini, zinu, zini, comes from a reconstructible root sn, while seneh is analyzed as having the root snh, and sanya has the root sn apostrophe here in the English transliteration. There is less of a barrier in relating the Akkadian sn to Hebrew nh, seneh, sinu to seneh. Then there is in relating these to Aramaic sanya. So, that's debatable, but I would just point back to this ya ending is Meissner showed how some Aramaic some Akkadian words with the long u can take on this ending, but it's in a more complex process, so that is open to debate. The Hebrew here can have arisen as a mater lectionis, a common addition to the bare SN root. So there's this possibility that it's this vowel holder sound, whereas the aleph is more meaningfully different. That's an argument that can be made or investigated. We also have a pair of parallels for this transition. So similar to how Meissner had a pair of parallels to show that this can happen from Akkadian, we do have we have one or two instances, and the only one I have here, I think there's a second one, but I could try to post. But we have here Akkadian sadu or sadum with an M is linguistically cognate, that is from a shared root with the Hebrew sadeh. So we have an Akkadian word, shadu, rather, I think it's a sh, apologize, becoming Hebrew shadeh. Okay, so that shows the long u of the Akkadian also becoming the eh through this process that also can happen in Hebrew adaptations. The pattern of Akkadian au, long u, thus becomes Hebrew a right? Or rather sorry. While we are similarly proposing that sinu becomes seneh. Thus, okay, so obviously, once again, it is a possibility which on its own doesn't prove anything, because there are some differences. You can see the first vowels are different. So you can ask yourself, well, would the same exact pattern of development happen if the first vowels are different? Or would the same, these are totally different words. How do we know the same process happened? It does not prove that the same process happened. It proves that the long u can be transformed in adaptation, in borrowing from an Akkadian word into a Hebrew word. Okay, and it opens that pathway where sinu could turn into seneh. The comparison would thus be shadu is to shadeh as sinu is to seneh. If seneh comes from the same root as sinu, then it would begin from the Semitic two-consonant word, which, as we saw in the CAD entry, is possibly of Sumerian origin or exchange. That's not clearly stated in the entry, but it is left as a possible way that this could have been Sumerian or parallel. It's things get lost in the mist of time whether that definitely came from Sumerian or not, but that's the possibility. The formation of seneh from this SN root follows a recognized segholate pattern. So there's a recognized pattern where this vowel change can happen, where a monosyllabic root SN, which requires the addition of a final vowel and mater lectionis to fit the expected rhythm for short concrete nouns. Okay, so in comparison to the previous possible cognates, the proposed derivation of seneh from sinu, or rather from a root shared by both, I'm not saying exactly what happened, is comparable to the formation of other segolate nouns. All right, so that's something to get into more if you know about the linguistics, which I don't. But this, I want to point out that I want to point the direction of what should be looked at. Rather than saying this definitively, I'm saying that there are other words that follow this pattern. The context of the narrative source, which is the linga pillar of the Shaivite Puranas, should only increase the plausibility of this linguistic argument corresponding to the reality of the case at hand. Meaning, the strength of the mythological evidence should support what is only a linguistic parallel, what is only a linguistic possibility, a pathway that's open, where this long U could turn into this H ending. That's only a possibility, but the mythological evidence should support the should increase the plausibility of that actually being what happened um, in this case. And again, you need to hold those two thoughts, I think, up in the air as possibilities, because I'm not saying just project it circularly like has been done. But on the other hand, everyone is always using the mythological basis as a supporting piece of evidence so that the whole picture should fit together. It's just that when the biblical assumption that it means bush is used as that supporting piece, there are more disjunctions, more things are contradictory and clearly circular and fall apart. Whereas if I'm arguing this is a more holistic case, and in that sense, the mythological should support the linguistic. Uh, in the when you put the cases side by side, one is stronger than the other. Okay, so it's always you're doing a puzzle, so everything's a puzzle, and I'm not against like some logic moving in a circle and support one corner of one puzzle piece supports the other corner of the other puzzle piece fitting back into the other side of the piece. You know what I mean? Like when you're doing a puzzle. But when you're forcing that due to an assumption and going against the lexical data and also the mythological data, I think that's when that circularity jumps out and becomes a problem. So according to the CID, Zenu means palm frond midrib. Palm frond midribs, other than mundane uses such as support poles, yes, here we go. Palm frond midribs, other than mundane uses such as support poles, are